By now, most international observers are aware of NATO's policy to not admit countries with ongoing territorial disputes. Critically, that means that, as long as Russia's invasion continues, Ukraine will not become a member of the organization. However, there are practical steps that Ukraine can take now, and is taking now, that will help facilitate the process once that other barrier disappears. Among other things, one trick is resolving something known as interoperability problems, which somehow involves the need to purchase a whole bunch of swivel chairs. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The story actually runs a whole lot deeper, and delves into the core construction principles of alliances. So, to better understand what is happening here, I sat down with Brad Smith, an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University's Department of Political Science, whose primary research focus is alliance politics. And, confession time, we overlapped in grad school and have written a ton of papers together. Anyway, I began by asking Brad about some of the fundamental differences between the alliances of yesteryear, like those from World War I and World War II, and modern-day alliances like NATO. One of the things that struck me in our conversation before recording is the evolution in alliance construction. Why don't you start off by going into detail about what has happened there?
So there have been big changes in what alliances look like. And this difference is especially stark when you compare the average alliance in the 19th century and the average alliance in the 20th century. In the 19th century, the typical alliance was designed to open a second front in an ongoing war, to divert the resources of an enemy away from the battle that they were fighting so that the initial combatant could get an advantage. If you look at an average alliance in the 20th century in contrast, they're much more about active coordination between the allies, and this leads to concerns about what we'd call interoperability, which is the ability for the two militaries to talk to each other and effectively work together in conjunction on the battlefield.
I think many of our listeners will readily grasp that there is a substantive difference between how older alliances function versus newer alliances by thinking about those examples from World War I and World War II versus the Cold War and NATO today. But what exactly caused that shift over time?
That's a great question, and scholars are still working this out, but I'll talk about a couple of forces. In some work with my Vanderbilt colleague Peter Bills, we set out to understand secret alliances. And this led us to think about two forces that have changed that might account for some of these changes in the way alliances look now versus how they did in earlier periods. So one of these changes is a big change in the distribution of interests in the international system. So in the 19th century, the international system was characterized by what scholars call multipolarity, which is the idea that the distribution of military power was relatively even across a large number of states. In contrast, in the post-World War II era, the international system was largely characterized by bipolarity, with most of the military power concentrated in the hands of the United States and the Soviet Union. The second change is the advent of nuclear weapons. The effect of this is pretty simple. It just increased the deterrent value of any alliance that included a member that was nuclear equipped. The consequence of these two changes is that alliances look different now. First, the transition to bipolarity made it much clearer who your friends are and who your enemies are. What this meant is that states were much less worried about having contradictory alliances and were less likely to keep them secret, as they were in the 19th century. The second force, the advent of nuclear weapons, just enhanced the deterrent value of alliances, such that the occurrence of a war was much less likely than it was in previous eras. Together, these two forces meant that alliances could be used for purposes that they previously weren't. NATO provides a very good example of this. Some work by a scholar named Tim Sale makes the argument that one of the primary purposes of NATO was in managing the internal politics of the members and making sure that none of them were taken over by some kind of unpredictable leader that might lead the entire alliance into an unfavorable conflict. Another effect of nuclear weapons and the enhanced deterrent value of alliances is that states had more room to breathe in terms of peacetime preparation for war. When you combine this with technological advancements like radio and satellite communications technology, what this meant is that allies could spend more time and effort planning for how to effectively fight together on the battlefield.
Well, that seems to raise an interesting issue that has direct implications for the future of Ukraine and NATO. You are saying that alliances want to be careful about who is running the member state countries, something that was unimportant during, say, World War II, when the United States just cared that Stalin was fighting off Hitler. Then there is having your alliance militarily function together. How long are these things taking in practice to implement in the modern era?
It can take quite some time, and we can look at the history of Poland and their relationship with NATO to get an idea of how long it takes. 1991 is when Poland first expressed interest in becoming a member of the alliance. In response to this, the NATO members got together and considered what would be necessary for them to be okay with Poland joining the alliance. 6 years later, in 1997, the NATO members concluded that Poland was finally ready, and they extended a formal invitation. But even then, it still took 2 years before Poland became a full NATO member.
I think that might be interesting to people who have only recently started paying attention to NATO politics, starting after the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Because what they're most familiar with, aside from what's going on with Ukraine, which of course is taking a long time, is the NATO entry from Sweden and Finland, both of which happened in relatively rapid succession. So could you describe a little bit about what went on there and why those two countries were so quick to be able to join?
The contrast between Sweden and Finland and Poland, or Ukraine, is really illustrative here. Sweden and Finland are both consolidated democracies, so NATO had no concerns about their internal politics, and they also have advanced modern militaries, so interoperability was much less of a concern. And so in this sense, Sweden and Finland were almost already NATO members, and they're not really representative of many of the aspirational members that we think about, like Ukraine.
Okay, the democratic institutions part seems relatively straightforward, and I could also understand why interoperability problems could arise, but I'm having a hard time conceptualizing exactly what that looks like. Is the problem preparing for a war, or is the problem what would happen if they were actually fighting a war?
It's really both. And those are related concerns. Let me give some examples. After World War II, the United States and the British realized that it would be really advantageous if the NATO members could agree to the same ammunition standards. And as it turns out, establishing the standard was actually pretty difficult for a variety of political and economic reasons, and the standard has also changed over the years.
Yeah, that was actually a big topic of conversation when I was at NATO headquarters a few months ago, that NATO as an organization is actually a political organization, and a lot of what was slowing that down was the politics of figuring out who's going to do what. And actually one of the benefits of having the organization in a single headquarters was that they were getting everyone into the same room, which actually reduced the transaction costs and the timing that went along with that and made that whole process a lot faster. Which I suppose is saying something, because it took so long. Despite that, it would have been far worse otherwise without having everyone headquartered in Brussels.
Exactly. And then there's the second consideration, which is the need for the Allies to engage in joint exercises and prepare for war during peacetime. This gives me a good opportunity to talk about a really interesting example. So, my co-author Brett Benson and I spent some time interviewing U.S. military officers who are involved in security force assistance brigades. So these are wings of the U.S. military that work with partner states in NATO to conduct these exercises. And what we learned is that they have what I think is a pretty funny term that describes perfectly one of these difficulties. It's called Swivelchairing, so let me explain what that means. When the U.S. is in the field conducting these exercises with partners, there's obviously a need for the two militaries to communicate with one another. The problem is that even still, the communications technologies of the US and the partners don't always talk to one another. They're just not compatible. So, for example, a radio from a partner country might just operate on a different frequency from the US radios. So this is an extension of the Mac and Windows problem, right? The files just can't be shared across the systems. And the reason that this is called Swivelchairing is that quite literally, in these NATO bases, there will be two computers, one that runs on the US system and one that runs on the partner system, and a swivel chair between them. And then an officer will have to sit in between these computers and manually take information from one of them and enter it into the other so that the US systems and the partner systems can communicate with one another. And this is happening during exercises. So you can imagine how many complications would arise if a war is actually happening.
And this is occurring after they've become members, right? So this is after they've solved some of these interoperability problems. They're still having interoperability problems.
That's right. It's completely a moving target. The delays that happen before membership occurs, sometimes that only gets you to a tolerable level of difficulty.
Well, why don't you get to this ideal perfect level then? Why do you have to accept something that's second best, like what is the case with NATO currently?
This ties back into these concerns about domestic politics within partner countries. You can imagine that when one of the partners sets out to sign a big contract for the procurement of one of these very expensive systems, that has implications for all kinds of political and economic interests within the partner country. So what this means is that the ideal acquisition of technology from the perspective of interoperability is not always the same as the ideal acquisition of technology from the perspective of an actor that's looking to cater to various domestic political and economic interests.
Before we go, I want to tie this back to Ukraine and talk about what Ukraine can be doing in the short run now that will help it enter into NATO in the long run. Obviously, the main hang-up to Ukraine's entry into NATO is the ongoing territorial dispute that it has with Russia, and NATO's own rules prevent countries that have unresolved territorial conflicts from being able to join the alliance. But the general theme for today is delay even aside from that. So I want to hear about the domestic political situation in Ukraine and what Ukraine can do to help move the process along on that front, and then separately what Ukraine can be doing to improve the interoperability problems with the military.
On the political end, it's pretty simple. Ukraine just needs to have a demonstrated record of having elections, and that hasn't happened enough times yet, and that just is going to take time. And another issue with the elections is that, obviously, as long as the war is going on, that makes holding these elections very difficult, and that may provide an incentive for Russia to prolong the war.
And that's going above and beyond the territorial issues, right? This is the domestic politics that's also affecting things on Russia's end.
That's right. And on the interoperability end, the war is actually posing more long-term problems. So one thing that I've discovered in some recent research and doing some interviews with U.S. military officials that have been involved in security cooperation efforts is that, the U.S. has been training Ukrainian officers for quite some time. And this training serves to bring them into the U.S. military's mode of organization and thinking on things, and really smooths a lot of these issues in terms of personnel when we're trying to operate together on the battlefield. The issue with the ongoing war, though, is that many of these officers who were going through this training were younger and were serving in the field, and unfortunately many of them have been killed.
Hold on, let me get this straight. Part of what NATO wants to see out of Ukraine for Ukraine to join is a removal, so to speak, of the old Soviet mindset, which is by and large inside of the minds of the older officers. The younger officers are the ones, however, that are fighting the war, and then as a consequence of that, disproportionately dying. So this seems like another way that Russia is stalling Ukrainian entry, whether intentional or not.
Yes, this is exactly what came up in these interviews, is as you described. And this is a real problem because all this progress that had been made in terms of, updating these younger Ukrainian officers, and training them in sort of the NATO doctrine, so to speak, has been undone. And so the war has actually resulted in them taking steps back.
That's perverse. Is there any upshot here, moving away from the human side of things and going toward the equipment side of things, given that over the course of 3 years, Ukraine has essentially burned through all of the old Soviet stockpile legacy weapons, and what it is receiving now from its Western partners, of course, are NATO kit?
Yes, I think that is a consequence of what's occurred in the war. And the effect that it will have further down the line is that it will have given Ukrainian troops the experience on the battlefield fighting with the weapons that NATO expects them to use if they become a member. However, that experience is limited somewhat in terms of the things that NATO cares about, because it's limited to this sort of equipment-based experience. What the Ukrainian troops are not getting in the course of the war is experience fighting on the battlefield directly alongside other troops from partner countries in NATO.
Well, I hope to travel to NATO in the next couple of months and maybe get some more direct answers to this. But I think for now, this is a great place to stop. I want to say thank you very much to Brad for spending the time here. So thank you, Brad.
Thank you for having me.
And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.